as I mentioned earlier, if you didn't hear me, we are condensing our schedule just a little bit. That's why we're kind of not rushing around, but we're kind of squeezing a few things together so we can finish just a touch early. That way we're not here baking at the very end of the day when it gets super hot. So we're going to hopefully try to get you out of here just a little bit early today. What we're going to do next is have a discussion about succession planning and legacy planning and what's entailed. And I know Glen and his family has gone through that quite a bit. And help lead that discussion, we have Amy Wirtz. She's a family business consultant, and she has a passion for business, enjoys working with entrepreneurs. She's been an owner in a law firm for most of her legal career. Many of her clients own closely held businesses, and she's very well versed in the complexities of running those businesses. And additionally, she serves on the advisory board for Newcomer Farms, and she's been a member of the Northeast Ohio Exit Planning Institute since its formation. She's an instructor for the Exit Planning Institute in Chicago, Illinois. She's also been a certified collaborative lawyer for over 13 years and a mediator for 8, which is obviously a good thing when you're working with family businesses and planning. These certifications require extensive training in interest-based negotiations, listening skills, reframing, and alternate dispute resolutions. She attended the University of Toledo for her undergraduate degree and presented on business succession for Farm Journals conventions and ARVC. And so let's give Amy Wirtz a warm round of applause.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we are excited that you're all here today to learn about how families can intentionally plan the succession of their farm to the next generation. Now, what's really great about Newcomer Farms is we're on what generation? Sixth. That beats all odds, except in farming. So typically, our families struggle going from second to third. And only 30% of businesses transfer in our family from second to third. Beyond third, it goes below 13%. So I would say those are true for most businesses. I believe that land holding companies last longer. And my theory is it's because the dirt gets in the blood and it becomes part of the social fabric of the family, and they identify so much with it. It's a little bit different than producing plastic widgets, because you grow up on the business, usually live in your business. So there are 3 different stages to this work. I think of it from the technical tax legal side is one stage. The next stage is the management side. How do you give the leadership and decision making to the next generation? How do you hand that off and pace it between the owning generation and the next generation? And the last is the family system. How does the passing of the baton, and that might mean management and ownership, affect everybody in the family? And do they get along? So really, when I work with business owners, we look at it from all 3 sections. And your team is going to change. I also teach transparency and team. So you'll see today that we have up here Glen Newcomer, Ann Newcomer, Jason Newcomer, their lawyer, Ryan Breininger, and their accountant, Tyson Stuckey. They have been very open with their next generation about their plans for ownership and management succession, which I think reduces conflict in the family. So Jason works on the farm, as many of you know, but they have 2 other children, Laura and Matt, thank you. And Matt is in Cincinnati and Laura is in Chicago. Laura is a lawyer and Matt works in the commercial real estate industry. And there is a next generation coming up because we have 2 born grandchildren and 1 on the way. So there may be a whole 7th generation that we're leading into ownership too. But with that being said, Glen, when your dad transitioned managing the farm to you, what 2 things worked well for you?
Well, I was very fortunate that I had a father who was very visionary and always had the desire to move on to the next generation. And at the same time, though, he made me prove myself every step of the way. It wasn't just a given. You had to prove yourself. But the 2 things that really made a difference as far as helping was the fact that he allowed me to manage, He allowed me to take charge at my pace as I wanted to. Now, I was pretty aggressive when I was young, and I wanted to manage. He was happy to pass the baton. I also look back at when he made the transition. He made a transition fully over to us when he retired at the age of 62, even though he worked until he was in his 70s. I look back to my grandfather. He did the same thing with my father. So we have a pattern that when the older generation nears or approaches retirement age, they recognize that their role needs to change and that you need to pass the baton to the next generation.
So Ann, when you were thinking about Jason coming back to the farm and working with Glen, what excited you about it and what made you nervous about it?
Well, I was excited that he made the decision to come back. One thing we've always done with our children is we've never pressured them to stay on the farm. We're gonna make sure it was their choice, not ours. So I was excited to know that on his own, Jason decided to come back. I was nervous, father and son working together. I did not know how that would go, and I knew I'd probably be in the middle, because
See, look at that.
so keeping the peace, but everything's worked out well, so that's good.
Jason, when you started on the farm, did you feel you had a job description and goals for your first year working here?
I don't think I had a set job description when I first started. We didn't come up with that till a couple years later when we came up with the employee handbook. But I just wanted to learn as much as I could when I first came back and just get acclimated with everyone and just be on good terms. I didn't want to step on anyone's shoes or take anyone's job. So I just wanted to find my own place when I came back.
So what was the first thing that became yours?
Say the first thing, like my first big project was like taking on the soil sampling.
Okay.
In 2016, we're starting to do that all in-house now, and I've done that every year. And, I build the soil zones and plot the points and pull the cores and then take them to the lab and get an analysis on them, so.
Okay. Ryan, so can you tell the audience a little bit about your practice, and what are 3 things that you would give as must-dos or tips to families going through this process?
Well, thanks, Amy. A little bit about me. My firm's been around since 1850. I've been in the law practice for 23 years. The ag world is really important to me. I've been involved in it since I've been a kid. I'm really honored to be here today. I tell everybody that's involved in the agricultural world, it is a difficult time, I think as everybody has stated, but there's positive approaches to having a succession plan. Glen and Ann have come up with a great succession plan. I think it's important. The 3 do's, well, you have to have a plan that both your son or daughter is involved in, even if they're not involved in the farming operation. What does that include? It's important, as Amy was saying, Glen and Ann have involved their non-involved farming children. Matt and Laura obviously know what's going on, so that's a do, that's a must. You have to have open communication with your family that's involved in the farming operation and with your non-involved in the farming operation. Very important. And then I think another do that I tell clients, the 3 do's, update your plan regularly. It's a fluid in process. It changes with your life. It changes with you. It's sort of like changing your socks. Even though, like, my youngest child, when he was little, never wanted to change his socks, you have to change your plan. It changes with you. The don'ts. A lot of older farmers, older generation farmers, their plan was to keep it secret. No communication with their family, no communication with the non-involved farming family members. And I think that's a don't. Obviously, it creates problems. Glen, his father, his grandfather, my partner who took care of the family for years, they were always open about communication. If you do not have communication, that's a no-no. The communication becomes very, very important moving forward in generation after generation after generation. I think the other problem that I see in today's practice, in my agricultural practice, in my estate planning, legacy planning, many of the plans are way too complicated. Many of my friends who are attorneys across the state, across the United States, tell me that their clients probably do not understand the plan they're involved in. Simplicity is always the best, but you have to make sure that your client, who is really the person directing the succession plan forward, is able to explain it to the involved farming person, in this case Jason, and the non-involved people, such as the other non-involved farming members. And the last, I think that is a no-no, a don't, is many clients want to farm until they die, farm until death. That just doesn't work. You can be involved in the farming, but as Glenn stated, his dad had a plan to go out. He was in a retirement mode, but had a plan to allow the legacy to continue forward with his children, his grandchildren. All of those things need to move in that direction. You have to have a plan. But honestly, one of the most important points to take out of this today, open communication. And as Amy said, transparency with the people you have involved in your operation. If you are not transparent, you will have problems because they do not know what the big picture is. Their concern is, how do I keep operating in a difficult time of agricultural, a difficult time for the world? Transparency is always the most important process involved in this legacy planning and the succession planning.
So next I'm going to ask that same question. I'm going to ask you to stick to the 3 positives, and then I'll circle back to you for the negatives. But Tyson has been with the Newcomer Farms since a year, about the same time I started, which was about the time that the board was created. And it's been an interesting growth period for Glen and Ann to be involved with Tyson. I would say, as someone on the board, I've watched them adopt a tax advisory versus just someone that prepares their returns. And Tyson's been very intricate on the team for creating their succession plan, looking at tax considerations, how to transfer ownership and land with all the complexities of embedded capital gains, and making sure that we're not just doing the legal side, but we're doing the tax planning at the same time. So Tyson, with that, do you want to talk to everybody about your tips?
Sure, thanks, Amy. My name is Tyson Stuckey, managing partner of Schultz, Huber & Associates, a local regional firm here in Northwest Ohio. And in that practice, we obviously, whenever you're in a rural community in Northwest Ohio, it certainly fits that. You're very involved in agriculture, so it's a significant portion of our business. And for the last number of years, we have been working with the Newcomer Farms and Newcomer family. And when I sit back and start working with an organization, especially a multi-generational organization that has multiple entities, a lot of different activities going on, it's interesting. I'm going to echo a lot of what Ryan said to some extent, because the first and most important thing is that communication that he was talking about, and communication within the family, but also within your advisors. The more you communicate, the more open dialogue we have, which takes time, takes energy, takes meetings, but the more you do that, the more we as advisors are able to understand, what are you looking for? What are your goals? For some people, that is absolutely to transition to next generation, and continue. Others have different plans. That's okay. That communication is the first step, because any planning needs to be built around, what does the family want? What are their goals? And it's also important to remember that it's not just the goals of the current management team. It's the goals of the next generation. As Ryan mentioned, it's the goals of those involved in the operation, but also those that aren't involved in the operation. So as you get a feeling for what is the family, what is this business organization looking for in those goals, you can then step back and say, well, there's a lot going on, whether it's actually farming, whether it's land ownership, whether it's crop insurance, seed sales, whatever different activities the overall organization is doing, you can look at and say, well, how do we take these resources, these different avenues of generating wealth for the family, and make sure that it's being split up in a way that makes sense for those that are continuing operating, as well as those that perhaps aren't as involved in the operations, so that communication and understanding and involving all the family members in it is really important. And honestly, the third thing I had, which was Ryan mentioned as well, was revisiting the plan. It's not a paperweight. It's not a shelf decoration. After you make a plan, you've got to go back and spend time with it. You've got to see, are we moving in the right direction still? Does this still make sense for the family? And I think Glen and this organization and the advisory board does a great job of thinking about and moving that forward and not just letting it sit there, because it forces interaction instead of just allowing the day-to-day fire drills that we're all dealing with. Every day there's something that day could be more important than long-term planning. Well, this kind of arrangement forces the management and forces the family to think about it. So really when I think about it, those are the key things. Then you take from those communication, from those plans, from that you can build. You can build what structures make sense, whether it's entity planning and obviously involving attorneys in the family, but also thinking, is the taxation of that entity the right structure? If I know someone wants to be done in 2 years or 100 years, totally changes the direction you might look at for tax strategies and for planning and where different assets and things should be located. So really that's starting with that communication and understanding of what the family wants and the organization and what's available. You then start to craft that plan from that.
So Glen, back to you. When your father transitioned the farm for you, what were 2 things that were hard that you struggled with a little bit?
For me or for my father?
Both. Both.
My father always told me that the most difficult thing for him to do was to allow me to make mistakes. I think we all have enough experience under our belt that it's very difficult to hold your tongue when you see the younger generation making a mistake that you had already addressed when you were younger, and it's like you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. It's like, I've been there, I've done that. Even though I hate that cliche, as I get older, it resonates with me a little bit more, because if I had to learn the hard way, I learned more from my mistakes than from my successes.
Can you stop there a minute?
Sure.
Can you say that again?
What did I say?
So what Glen just said is, and this is really
Yeah.
important for the owning generations, I
Yeah.
learned more
Oh,
from my
mistakes.
mistakes than I did from my successes.
Yes, that's very true. And I've made a lot of mistakes. Hindsight's 20/20. We can all go back and say what we coulda, shoulda, woulda done differently when we were young, and it's very difficult as an older generation to look at the younger generation and not steer them in the right direction. And some things you just realize they have to figure it out for themselves. And sometimes those lessons can be costly, but at the same time you have to allow them to discover the problems associated with a bad decision in order to appreciate the decisions of a good decision, the results of a good decision.
You also mentioned, Glen, in our prep for this, that when you and Ann were discussing this, it was a little bit about like you were go, 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 and you were the accelerator and Dad was kind of the brake.
Yeah,
we talked about pacing a little bit.
Yeah, that's actually the analogy that we used. I was the throttle and he was the brake. And somehow we moved forward. And I guess there's a proportion there of the amount of time you use the accelerator and the amount of time you use the brake. My dad was the brake in a sense in that he held me back, maybe too much, but because of the concern. When we started farming, we were in the 80s. And every decision that we made was a difficult decision because of the finances that was just current, or was going on during the 80s. And so even though I was young and naive, I still had that fire, that desire to grow and do things. And yet my father still had the wisdom, and we also understood the reality of where the finances were in the 80s. So part of my philosophy today still is a result of what I experienced through the 80s. And my dad told me that he would allow me to make choices, but he was my backup in case I failed. And I never wanted to fail.
So I see it a lot in my work. A lot of what I do with clients is manage the eagerness of the incoming generation and the change in risk profile of the older generation. The younger generation typically wants to build and grow, and the older generation wants to preserve their wealth. And that is what we call pacing between generations. And it is constant. It's no different than when you're driving your tractor or your car. You have to find the right speed to make it work and function well. And that is constant in this work. And if you think you're going to get that pace and it's going to stay steady, you are kidding yourself. So you always have to be having conversations between the owning generation and the next generation about that issue. Are we growing fast enough, or are we growing too slow? Because honestly, that's where I see the most conflict in transferring management and ownership between farmers. And your question next is, so you're worried about being in the middle between Jason and Glen. Have you been, and how do you handle that? How's it been?
There are a few times Jason, he comes in. I'm not in the day-to-day operations around here, so I'm sort of removed from that. So Jason knows that anytime he can come in and talk to me, if he's just, irritated about something or, not happy, but it's not very often, but, I listen to what he has to say. And then sometimes Glen might say a few things that happened maybe when Jason was working, and I listen to him, but I just listen and just try to, keep the peace. But really, they get along very well. I was nervous about that, but they get along very well. They talk well together, talk things out, so.
So you're really just a sounding board.
Sounding board, yes.
Yeah. So congratulations, that's a gift from God.
Well, I might give a few opinions, but I'm not going to say I don't, but, right?
But I would say, having the blessing of just being a sounding board is wonderful. And one of my tips to what I call the chief family officer, the woman or man that is running the family side and the family relationship side, is make sure you understand what role you're in when you're having those conversations. Are they coming to you as a mom or a father? Or are they coming to you as an owner or as in your management role? Because those might be very different conversations. And the other thing you have to remind them is, I sleep with the owner. So please don't ask me to keep a lot of questions, because it's hard to keep them. And it affects your marriage. So be careful with triangulation between people, and be conscious of what role you're playing when you have these conversations, so you don't put yourself behind the 8 ball. So Jason, how has your job grown from where you started to where it is now?
Over the years, I've been getting more and more responsibilities and taking over more control of things. So like I said earlier, like I did the soil sampling, that was my baby. And then I took over all the spraying in 2017, pretty much for the most part. And then like I incorporated using a drone on the farm for scouting fields and stuff. 2018, I think that's when I made my first grain sale, when you weren't around. You guys were on vacation.
Look at that face.
The bean prices were good that day, so I called the elevator and sold 5,000 bushels of beans on my own. So, good for me. And then 2019, we started using Granular, which is like a management software for farm. And that's pretty much my all responsibility. And then,
So Jason, in that time frame was really, you started on the farm when?
2015.
So really, that's a lot of responsibility in a short time, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel that way or no?
I feel like I could probably take on more,
Awesome.
but I'm ready
Going back
for
to
it.
that pacing thing, guys. Okay, so Ryan, how much of your time is talking to your clients about the pacing issue, or trying to establish that neutral role to help them figure out their documents in a time that works for everybody, so the next generation doesn't take off?
Right, I think the biggest problem that we see in today's world is it's either moving too fast and the documents aren't catching up with where we're at today, or moving too slow, and then the younger generation, or such as Jason's, they would take off to another job or another facility or another availability to them. So we try to work with them on a weekly basis, monthly basis, whatever has to happen in terms of preparing the documents and re-sitting down, making sure that both are moving at the same pace. One of the most difficult things, I think, as an attorney, as a mediator, is explaining, as you said, Amy, that hat wearing, that is specifically in this case, like Ann is wearing different hats. Sometimes Jason may be going to her as the owner, sometimes it's going to her as mom, and you have to explain that you're also an owner, and you have to explain to employees, this is the situation we're in, pacing needs to be slowed down, we have to make sure that we have this in the right order. And then usually conflict occurs when pacing is out of order, or there has not been a plan that everybody sees the big picture. You try to work from the big picture, tail end, this is where we're going, to this is the timeline we're working in. And Glen is one of the most exceptional clients in terms of having timelines, having order things. He's OCD like I am, so that it helps very, very drastically in keeping things in order. If you do not have that, what ends up happening is it's total chaos. And no one knows who's supposed to do what. Job descriptions, everything's out of order, everything's out of kilter. And I find that really it's a very important process explaining to clients what pacing is, keeping everybody on the same page, keeping everybody on the same big picture.
So Tyson, what 3 tips do you have for our audience of what not to do when you're doing your succession plan?
Sure. One of the key things that I like to focus on when you're doing a succession planning and working with an organization like this is to don't focus on the short term. It's really easy to worry about what's going on right now, whether it's, the pandemic, whether it's the current weather, whether it's, those kind of things. Absolutely important. But focus on the long term. Where are you trying to go? Because when you're making decisions, if you're just constantly switching back and forth because of short-term reactions to things, you don't end up getting where you want. Or if you do, it takes a lot longer because you go this way, that way. You're turning all over the place instead of just working more gradually towards that long-term solution. And it's easy to, from a tax or an accounting standpoint, it's easy to have knee-jerk reactions to whether it's a tax law change or whether it's just the current environment. And I find that the clients that are less focused on the long term, so if they're focused on the short term, they're more interested in I don't want to pay any taxes this year. I never want to pay taxes, those kind of philosophies. And obviously everyone wants to manage the tax load. I mean, that's important. But if you're constantly focused on the short term and not paying this year, sometimes what happens is when the actual final bell rings, and you pay your taxes, it's a lot higher than it would have been if you just work through it gradually over time. And that's one of the things I like to work with clients on, is to understand that paying some taxes isn't a bad thing, especially in the what we call the bracket system, where you can play at lower rates before you get to some of those higher rates. So keeping that long-term perspective is really important. You can't lose sight of short-term things going on, but always focus on the long-term, where you're trying to go. I think that plays out in a lot of life, not just taxes or in estate or succession planning. So I think that probably is the biggest thing, in addition to when you're focused on that long term, understanding that, and when we started working with Newcomer Farms in Glen, one of the focuses that Glen had, and this might have been his accelerator tendency, was to pay off everything immediately. And this is just something that really came to me as I was sitting back thinking about this. And when we sat down about 2 years ago and said, does that philosophy make sense? It does in the short term because you're getting rid of debt. You're getting rid of the short term. You're getting rid of interest. But when you look down the long-term road, we don't know what's going to happen in a couple years. So we had made some moves within his debt structure to term some things out longer, which got us lower interest rates. And then in the last couple years, as we've kind of gone through a couple different issues, whether it's wet spring, whether it's different in the pricing, commodity pricing, it's extremely been beneficial for working capital position. But it's all because we did that long-term planning a couple years ago and didn't focus on, we had the cash right then, so we could have done something different. If we had, it's always more difficult to borrow when you need money. The easiest time to borrow is when you don't need money. So planning down the road and saying, what could happen? Let's look at the opportunities that exist within your landlords. Are there things coming that we need to be prepared for? Just kind of thinking down that long-term stretch instead of just focusing on today and this year is really important. So I think that's you never want to focus purely on short-term.
So when I talk, yeah, how are we doing on time? Okay. So Glenn, when Tyson's talking about long-term planning, I like to make analogies. I'm thinking about how we take C ground and turn it into A ground. That takes time. Doesn't happen overnight, right?
No,
No.
it's a process.
Right. And so I always think farmers are really equipped to do long-term planning. You do it in your production all the time. So if you can think of your succession plan the way you think about your land and what you need to do to take care of those fields to get the best results that you can at harvest, you know, you put your tile in, you put the inputs in, you buy the right kind of seeds, you have the right kind of equipment. It's the same for your succession plan. So Glenn, with that caveat in mind, what do you think the secret was for your team in getting this plan done? Do you think having a good team impacted the success of your succession plan?
We're going to elaborate more on that this afternoon, of the value of what the Business Advisory Board brings to the table. Several of those gentlemen are older than I am, and I always was asking them, if you were my age, what would you be doing? So they had the rear viewpoint of what we should be focused on. But since we started working with Tyson, and since the retirement of David Newcomer as our attorney, and we started working with Ryan, the collaborative conversations that we have had up here together, along with our advisory board, collectively we came up with the plan and the idea, and we included our other siblings, our other children as well in those conversations so that they were fully aware. So that communication component is invaluable. I mean, you can't put a value on that, but the open book policy, or the amount of conversation that has to happen between these two, is critical. And from my viewpoint, having a good attorney and a good accountant, tax planner, business planner, that financial expert working with your attorney can build the documents, can build the plan, can structure it so that that transition is smooth. 6 months ago, or beginning of February, my father passed away. And because we have a farm, one of our farm corporations was Newcomer Farms. I have 5 other entities, but the one that my father was part of originally was Newcomer Farms. That transition and transfer of ownership of his remaining shares to us was a clean process. And so that transition was very straightforward, very clean, and it's, even though it's still painful and you're sad because of the loss of a parent, that transition was very smooth, and it probably went even more smooth for us than it did when my grandfather passed away and my father had to settle up with his 2 sisters. And so we've gone through the process twice now, and I'm hoping that we can improve that even more when we pass. So it's having that continued focus, realizing that we all are going to die someday, and having that succession plan, that transition plan, that can't be given enough attention.
So I'd like to, for time-wise, throw it out to the audience for questions at this point in time. What questions do all of you very awake people and hungry people out there have? Anybody? Oh. It'll be a lot more fun if you do. Yeah.
Are you updating, not continuously, but every year do you look back and fine-tune things or talk about things?
I'm going to let Ryan answer that.
Did you get that? Do you need to have him repeat that? Yeah, because it's being,
Okay.
sorry.
I just wanted to know if you, I know you wouldn't do it real often, but every year do you go back and look at things like you say, this is a moving thing, a moving entity where your ideas change or different opportunities avail themselves. How often do you go back and revise these things?
Right. I think it's very important with the number of entities that that are involved in this particular case, that we meet quarterly. I talk to Glenn once a month. I think it's very important. It depends on the number of entities, but it's fluid. So if you are updating, I would say statistically probably once a year you should, if in your case, or whatever those are. Depends on the number of entities, depends on the number of really involved family members, it depends on the number of employees. There's a lot of issues you have to look at. But the more that you communicate, as Glenn said, with your attorney and with your accountant, they are more involved and know what the changes are. It's fluid, it's moving. And not getting together, not going through those documents, not going through the gifting documents. I depend on Tyson, and Tyson depends on me. So, and I think then it depends on the family to give us that information. So sometimes you have to make sure that everybody goes through that process on a quarterly basis, or at least I usually advise my clients every 6 months I have to see you.
So when you guys talk, when you and Tyson talk, have you, with Glenn's team or other teams, do you often find that you're also involving other professional advisors, like life insurance advisors or financial advisors or bankers? Do you wind up working together with those people as well, or no?
I guess I'll take a shot at this. I advise my clients, I'm involved with your banker, I'm involved with your CPA, I'm usually involved with your business consultant, such as you're involved in this, Amy, or you're involved with the people that are going to help make decisions that make sense for the employees, the family, the non-family. And in my opinion, your accountant, your CPA is usually one of your important tools that can direct what is best for your business, what is best for your rental business, what's best for your trucking business, what's best for everyone involved. The CPA, in my opinion, can help direct the attorney, because sometimes I think the attorney takes too big of a role. And in my case, I find it to be very helpful in this particular instance with the Newcomer family, the Newcomer Farms, that I have all the helpful people. Because listening is the best advice. Meaning I listen to Tyson, and I'm sure that he listens to me. I listen to Glen and Ann, and then Jason has a play where this comes in, and now it's time to listen to Jason on some things. It's very important, and you get all levels, and it's very important on that process.
So Jason, are you starting your succession plan even though you're fairly young?
I have not started it yet, no.
But I bet Ryan has some documents you've implemented already, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's already signed a portion of his documents. I'll give him that credit. So, but he has done the right thing, a succession plan. Everyone should have a succession plan. Whatever it is, you need to update it and make sure that your family that's involved in the farming operation has some idea, and the non-family members have some idea, because there's always a question about what's supposed to happen.
So Ann, have you seen the planning actually work for you and your family? Has there been an incident where you have really relied on the succession or the contingency planning at all that we've done?
You mean as far as that was there and it helped?
Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest time was when he had his accident, and I mean, his peace of mind knowing things were in line and lined up and everyone knew what was going on, and because we didn't know how that was going to turn out.
Yeah.
So that was the big one.
Yeah.
When he had his motorcycle accident.
Any other questions in the audience?
To those on the panel that are of my generation, how did you handle equity with your non-farm kids? I didn't say fairness, I said equity. Then I have a follow-up question for Jason when you're done.
Go on.
I think there's something to be said for being fair and what's equitable. I think our older two children realize that if they're not here helping to build the operation, if they were given an opportunity, I think Anna even said that earlier, that we did not discourage or encourage any of our children, but they all knew that they had an opportunity if they wanted to. We didn't put any pressure on our children. At the same time, though, just like for myself, I've spent the last, my whole life, but I'll just say 40 years, I'll round it up, ever since I was a teenager, I've worked on the farm here and I've helped build this. And even though I had my own enterprises, like with the Pioneer Seed and the insurance business and all those other things, the farm was something that I helped grow and build. And my father made it clear to me that when I started in the 80s, he says, I can't pay you much. And I think we worked for $1,000 a month. As I recall, it was $12,000 a year was what I came home to, was what we lived on, and I had to find other income in addition to that to support our family. But my father promised me then that, he says, if you come back and you take over the farm or you work with me, you will be rewarded equitably with additional land and shares in the company and stuff. And so we're trying to be very similar in that with Jason, because if he's helping to build the operation along with our team, our employees and everyone, I mean, we're a team effort around here. But as far as with our children, if he spends the time here and he's investing his life to this, if he's committed, and I realize things can change, you never know about the future, but he's going to be treated differently than the other two. And I think we had, at the advisory board meeting that we invited them to, they were quizzed down pretty heavily, and with our advisory board members, so that they got an understanding and a sense, and that we got feedback from them of where they are in the whole situation. And they still have the opportunity today, if they would want to invest in our operation, they are welcome to come back and invest.
I do want all of you to know I am a champion of family businesses, including family members that may not be on the farm, using them in other ways. And since Glen's daughter is a lawyer and his other son is in the commercial real estate industry, I constantly say they don't have to be here to contribute to this business. They can do a small consulting contract and give you some advice in different ways. They can open up opportunities to Jason in the future. They can lend him money and do a promissory note for a farm and land purchase and make money that way. So just because your kids aren't on the farm doesn't mean they can't impact the business in different modalities, as long as you do the planning to make it successful.
Have you considered the possibility that there are better opportunities outside of agriculture?
Yeah, I've thought about it before, but I just feel like this was what I was drawn to and my calling, I guess. I don't know what else I'd be doing right now, honestly. I feel like it's just the perfect job for me, and I love it, so I'm going to stick around for a while.
Any other questions in the audience?
So you talked earlier about the older generation having a succession plan but keeping it secret. So how do you go about starting that conversation? Do you just rip the Band-Aid off? Or because you don't want to look like you're trying to push them out, obviously, but something needs to be done, especially if you want the farm and the land to stay in the family for generations.
It's a very good question. It's asked of me all the time. It's a lot of times I think it's difficult. Many fathers, mothers want to farm until their death. So it's a very difficult conversation, but you have to rip the Band-Aid off, because if you don't, the probate court will. So it's unfortunate, and in today's world, the agricultural world has become, it's an open communication that solves lots of better issues. That's why this operation is very, very successful. Open communication started with his father and his grandfather, and it continues down. You have to have a meeting with whoever your father or mother trusts and bring them into the meeting. That meeting can be held in the shop. Sometimes it's a better approach than taking them to the lawyer's office, because sometimes they feel forced. The accountant's office, sometimes they feel forced. Sometimes the best approach is just have an open meeting with the attorney appearing at the house, whatever needs to happen. But that meeting has to be had if you're trying to keep the legacy going forward. And the legacy is dirt, farming, whatever that be, manufacturing, whatever it is.
So I'd like to take a stab at answering this too. This is the question I get 100 times a day, okay? One very successful tool to get the owning generation to start thinking about passing it forward is to go backwards. If you have young adults as children or people in high school, taking a record of the owning generation's process of gaining ownership from, like, what was it like when you got the farm? How did you acquire it? Was it a gift? Was it purchased? And then tell me everything that you've done in this business until now. Having the respect developed of all of the things that they have accomplished allows them to begin to visualize the next. It is magical. It is not a magic wand that makes it always work, but it often opens the door for conversation that's been avoided. And a lot of times the generation that's trying to own learns why the owning generation doesn't want to do it, because it was a very painful, messy process when they did it, and they don't like conflict, and they don't want it to look the same, but they don't know how to do it different. So I always say, go backwards, build respect, learn and listen first, and then move into the planning stage. Any more questions? Okay, so Jason, I have one more question for you as the next gen. What one or two things are you planning or thinking about doing in the next 5 years to brand this farm as yours?
It's kind of a wild idea. Dad and I kind of talked about it before, but maybe possibly in the future turning Octagon Barn across the road in like a farmer's market. I don't know, maybe put up a couple greenhouses and start selling produce out of that. I don't know. It's kind of up in the air, but...
So when are we starting that business plan?
Right now.
All right. Thank you.
All right, well, we're just about ready for lunch, but before we do that, y'all can jump down if you'd like. Obviously, we couldn't do this without having some great sponsors here, so we want to invite the folks from New Holland to come on up and just give us a couple minutes and talk a little bit about some of their equipment and some of the things they're doing, and then we'll turn it over to lunch, and then Machinery Pete, I think I saw him roll it. There he is in the back. Greg Peterson in the house, everybody. All right, let's have the folks in New Holland. Come on up.
Thanks, Clinton. So do we have any history or trivia buffs in the room? Anyone? Okay, I got some head nods, so that's good. So I'm going to take you back to the year 1895. So in that year, America had its first car race from Chicago to Evanston and back. It was 6 cars, 55 miles. The first professional football game was in 1895, and the winning quarterback was paid $10 and won the game 12-0. Times have definitely changed. And then in 1895, Abe Zimmerman founded New Holland. And for 125 years, New Holland has constantly innovated and invested in 3 things vital to your livelihoods: agricultural and construction products, technologies, and service, all of which are designed to help you work more efficiently, sustainably, and profitably. My name is Becky Rader. With me today is Cole Sanford. We both have been with the company for 15 years, so know a few things about your industry as well as equipment specifically. And I know we only have a short amount of time here between you and lunch, but we do hope at the end of our short time together that you will give New Holland a consideration when you make your next purchase. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Cole.
All right, thanks, Becky. I want to thank Glen and family from the folks at Newcomer Farms. This is a fantastic facility, and I've picked up a lot. We've been intently listening to everything, and I'm a product specialist based in London, Ohio, so not too far from here, on high horsepower tractors and combines. And I'm so rifle focused on the equipment that I completely forget about the whole other side of the business. And you guys are fortunate enough to see Missy Bauer with the corn talk, and then the folks on the board that's discussed all the things about succession planning. So this is an awesome meeting. I'm glad we got to participate in it. From a standpoint of what was kind of discussed up through this, you know, and Becky hit on it, with our 125th anniversary with New Holland as a company, technology is a core focus of the brand. It has been since forever. In fact, in 2020, this year, we are celebrating our 45th anniversary of twin rotor combines. That was a technology piece that started about 7 years before I was born. So my dad has a pretty good experience with that, with his involvement with New Holland at a dealership and growing up around the equipment. And I saw technology firsthand before I could walk. So I mimicked Jason's words, but it's the only thing he knows. And that's why he came back. Same thing with the brand, and same thing with technology, and same thing with agriculture when it comes to my background with the company. So that technology piece is huge. Just last year, in 2019, we launched a self-setting combine with IntelliSense. So it takes in all the things that I've spent my career trying to determine. The best thing about a combine is it's the most humbling machine on planet Earth, because every year it's a different condition. I love that infinite possibility because it challenges me to try to master the combine. Now we have a button. So we hit the button and it takes over and does all those things. That's why I asked the question about the higher moisture corn with Missy's talk, because as that yield discussion starts to kind of come to fruition, she hit the nail on the head with those topics about harvesting at higher moisture. What's the Achilles heel of a combine? Harvesting at higher moisture, both downstream from the machine to the bin site like we toured, and both inside the combine itself. So if we can hit a button on the machine and call out a specific bushel per hour out of the combine, which our system allows us to do, we can get a steady stream of grain coming from that combine so our downstream support can support Glen's needs that he has on his site. That we can maybe bump that 18 to 20% moisture corn up into that 22, 23 like Missy talked about. And I think, you know, when we talk about that technology piece and employ it with the financial end and all the things that the payback and all the things that go into the operation, I think that's where this technology piece comes in. Another thing that's exciting for 2020 is we launched the new T9 tractors with PLM intelligence. And that's our new architecture on T8, Genesis T8 tractors. It was launched in 2019, as well as in the T9 with PLM intelligence for 2020. Those architecture chunks, if you will, of the tractor give the ability to seamlessly transmit data back and forth. We can whip up our phone and we can see how much fuel and how much DEF is in the unit. I think I've used that mostly just in chasing company units around. But as a farm producer or as a grower, you've got that ability to get all that information at your fingertips. And I think the easier the information to get is, much like his scales that he talked about, that made life easy. There was a tiny detail about the farm that made his life easy. Think about that tiny detail when it comes to tractors or comes to products that are generating the data, because that's all our vehicles are doing. They're just generating data and hopefully a clean grain sample, right? And no losses. So those types of things all encompass the total picture, and I think that helps feed the farm and helps win when you go with our products. So that's kind of what I had. I think I'm the person. Oh, is there one more?
I'm sorry. I got to just interject. I have to give a shout out to the construction side of our business, because also new this year are our 300 series skid steer and compact track loaders. So I don't know, almost every farm I've been to, I've seen a skid steer on it to do all those, you know, extra chores that are needed. So we did also launch a new line of skid steers with an 8-inch touchscreen display with a backup camera. And of course, we've built upon our Super Boom vertical linkage. So if you still need a vertical lift machine, we've built upon that technology. We still do offer radial lift machines as well. And then stop back in the corner there and visit Cole and myself before you leave. We've got some goodies, and since all the shows are going virtual, we've got a list of the upcoming shows where you can interact with us online. We've created our own proprietary 3D virtual space. Of course, I'm going to sound biased, but it is really cool. So stop back, pick up a flyer or a hat, and say hi to Cole and myself. And again, thank you for giving us a few moments to speak here. We do think that our brand is worth giving a peek at the next time you are in the market. And touch on the fact too that our dealer network is ready as well to lend support with all these changes. You know, changes is every day, right? And so we're ready to support that as well. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to visiting with you the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And they'll be in the back corner, so if you want to visit with them a little bit, make sure you run over there. All right, we're going to open up for lunch. Let's try to just do it a table at a time, see if we can get going from there. Heather, do you want to give us the go-ahead of whenever? Okay, go ahead, she says. All right, go ahead. Let's do it. We'll do some lunch, and then Machinery Pete will be up to talk as we kind of work through it.